If you've ever had to protect someone when the whole world was trying to tear them away, when you had to become someone stronger than you ever thought possible just to keep innocent lives safe, then hit that subscribe button right now. Because this story will show you what it truly means to stand between children and the darkness that wants to swallow them whole. The autumn of 1943 arrived in Warsaw like a thief in the night, stripping away the last pretenses of normal life and leaving behind only the raw, brutal reality of occupation. The city that had once been called the Paris of the North, with its elegant boulevards and Baroque architecture, its cafes filled with intellectuals debating philosophy over strong coffee, its concert halls echoing with Chopin's nocturnes, had been transformed into something unrecognizable. The streets that had once bustled with life now lay half empty, patrolled by soldiers in gray uniforms whose eyes held no warmth, no mercy, only the cold efficiency of an occupying force that had long since stopped seeing the people around them as human beings worthy of consideration. Anna Kowalski was 32 years old that autumn, though the lines around her eyes and the gray threading through her dark brown hair made her look older. She had been a schoolteacher before the war, one of thousands of young women who had chosen education as their calling, who believed that shaping young minds was the most important work a person could do. She had studied at Warsaw University, graduating in 1933 with honors in literature and pedagogy, and had spent the next 6 years teaching at a primary school in the Praga district, a working-class neighborhood on the eastern bank of the Vistula River, where families lived in modest apartment buildings and children played soccer in the narrow streets between the buildings. Anna had grown up in Warsaw herself, the daughter of a postal clerk and a seamstress, in a small apartment that always smelled of her mother's cooking and her father's pipe tobacco. She had been an only child, unusual for Polish families of that era, and her parents had poured all their hopes and resources into her education. Her childhood had been filled with books, with trips to museums and theaters, with Sunday dinners where relatives gathered around a table laden with pierogi and bigos, and her grandmother's famous poppy seed cake. She had learned to love learning itself, the way knowledge could open doors to worlds beyond the narrow confines of her neighborhood, and she had wanted to share that love with as many children as possible. The war had changed everything, as wars do. When Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939, the world Anna had known ceased to exist almost overnight. The occupation government had immediately set about destroying Polish culture and education, closing universities and secondary schools, banning the teaching of Polish history and literature, transforming the education system into a tool for creating a compliant workforce rather than educated citizens. Teachers were particular targets of the Nazi regime, viewed as dangerous because of their potential to preserve Polish identity and inspire resistance. Thousands of teachers had been arrested in the first months of occupation, sent to concentration camps, or simply shot in mass executions designed to decapitate Polish intellectual life. Anna had survived those early purges through a combination of luck and caution. She had stopped teaching officially, but had immediately joined the underground education network that sprung up almost as soon as the schools were closed. Secret schools, called Completi, operated throughout occupied Poland, meeting in apartments and basements and attics, moving locations constantly to avoid detection, teaching children the subjects that had been banned by the occupiers. It was dangerous work, punishable by death if discovered, but thousands of teachers did it anyway because they understood that if an entire generation grew up without proper education, without knowledge of their own history and culture, then Poland would cease to exist even if the war was eventually won. Anna taught in 3 different Completi by 1943, moving through the city on foot or by tram, carrying her teaching materials hidden in shopping bags or wrapped in innocuous-looking parcels. She taught Polish literature to teenagers who met in a tiny apartment near the ruins of the ghetto, mathematics to primary students who gathered in the basement of a church, and history to a mixed group that assembled in the back room of a bakery whose owner was part of the resistance. The work was exhausting and terrifying and paid almost nothing, but gave her life meaning in a time when meaning was hard to find. The apartment building where Anna lived stood on a quiet street in the Mokoto district, a middle-class neighborhood that had suffered less physical damage than other parts of the city, but had been equally devastated by the occupation in other ways. The building was 4 stories tall, constructed of brick in the 1920s with an architectural style that reflected the optimistic modernism of that era. It had 20 apartments, housing a mixture of families, elderly couples, and single people like Anna, who lived alone in small one-bedroom units that had been designed for efficiency rather than comfort. Before the war, the building had been a place of community. Neighbors knew each other, looked out for each other's children, gathered in the courtyard on summer evenings to talk and smoke and let the children play. But occupation had changed the social dynamics, introducing suspicion and fear into relationships that had once been simple and trusting. No one knew for certain who might be an informer, who might report suspicious activity to the authorities in exchange for extra rations or protection or simply out of spite. People became careful about what they said and to whom they said it, conducting their lives behind closed doors and shuttered windows, venturing out only when necessary. Anna lived on the third floor, in an apartment that consisted of one large room that served as both bedroom and living space, a tiny kitchen barely large enough for one person to stand in, and a bathroom she shared with her neighbor across the hall. The apartment was sparsely furnished with pieces she had inherited from her parents, who had both died within months of each other in 1941, her father from a heart attack, and her mother from pneumonia complicated by grief and malnutrition. A narrow bed against one wall, a small table with 2 chairs by the window, a wardrobe that held her limited clothing, and a bookshelf that still contained perhaps 30 volumes, a fraction of the library she had once owned before she had been forced to sell or trade most of her books for food. The window of her apartment looked out over the courtyard, a rectangular space enclosed by the building on 3 sides and a wall on the 4th. There were a few struggling trees in the courtyard, their leaves turning brown and yellow in the autumn chill, and a small garden area where some of the residents had tried to grow vegetables with limited success in the poor urban soil. In peacetime, children had played in that courtyard, their laughter echoing off the brick walls. Now it was usually empty except for the occasional person hurrying across to hang laundry or fetch water from the communal pump. October brought rain to Warsaw, cold and persistent, the kind that soaked through clothing and chilled to the bone. The city's infrastructure had been badly damaged by the initial invasion and subsequent bombings, and repairs were sporadic at best. Many buildings had no heat, electricity was unreliable, and water pressure was so low that people often had to carry water up multiple flights of stairs in buckets. Food was rationed and scarce, with official rations providing perhaps half of what a person needed to survive. The black market flourished, but prices were astronomical and supplies unpredictable. People learned to survive on very little, stretching meals with potatoes and grain, making soup from vegetable scraps, trading whatever possessions they still had for food. Anna had adapted to these conditions as everyone had, learning to make do with less, to be creative with the limited resources available, to suppress the constant gnawing hunger that had become the background noise of daily existence. She had learned which black market contacts were reliable, which streets were safest to walk at certain times of day, which neighbors could be trusted and which should be avoided. She had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated increased German military activity or impending roundups, to sense when it was time to stay indoors and wait for danger to pass. But nothing could have prepared her for what happened on October 15th, 1943. The day had started normally enough. Anna had woken before dawn, as she always did, in the darkness of her unheated apartment. She had dressed in layers, wearing nearly everything she owned because the cold was already seeping through the walls, and she knew it would only get worse as winter approached. She had eaten a small breakfast of ersatz coffee made from roasted grain and a slice of dark bread with a scraping of margarine, measuring out each portion carefully to make her rations last. Then she had gathered her teaching materials and prepared to leave for her first class of the day. The bombing started at 7:30 in the morning, without warning, without the air raid sirens that usually gave people at least a few minutes to seek shelter. The sound was earth-shattering, a roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once, followed by the shriek of falling bombs and concussive explosions that shook buildings to their foundations. Anna had been halfway down the stairs when the first blast hit, close enough that she felt the shock wave through the walls, saw dust and plaster rain down from the ceiling, heard the awful sound of shattering glass and collapsing masonry. She ran back up the stairs without thinking, operating on pure instinct, knowing that she needed to get to the basement, to shelter, to anywhere that offered protection from the bombs that were now falling with terrible regularity. Other residents were emerging from their apartments, faces white with fear, children crying, everyone moving toward the stairs that led down to the basement storage area that served as the building's unofficial air raid shelter. Anna reached the ground floor and was heading toward the basement entrance when she heard the screaming. It was coming from outside, from the courtyard, high-pitched and terrified, the unmistakable sound of children in mortal fear. Through the shattered windows of the entrance hall, she could see them, a group of children huddled against the far wall of the courtyard, trapped in the open as bombs fell around them, frozen with terror and unable to move. Later, Anna would never be able to fully explain what happened next, why she made the choice she made, why she ran toward danger instead of away from it. Perhaps it was her training as a teacher, the instinct to protect children that had been ingrained in her through years of practice. Perhaps it was simply the inability to walk away from children in mortal danger, to save herself while leaving them to die. Perhaps it was something deeper, some fundamental aspect of her character that refused to accept the unacceptable, that chose action over paralysis even when action seemed suicidal. She ran into the courtyard, into the open air where bombs were falling and shrapnel was flying, where death could come at any instant from any direction. The noise was indescribable, a wall of sound that felt almost physical in its intensity. The sky above was full of smoke and fire, and she could see the silhouettes of bombers passing overhead, could hear the whistle of falling ordnance getting louder and louder until the explosion came and everything disappeared in a blast of heat and pressure and flying debris. The children were from the neighboring building. She realized as she got closer, children she recognized from the neighborhood, though she didn't know all their names. They ranged in age from perhaps 5 to 12, and they were clustered together like frightened animals, some crying, some silent with shock, all of them paralyzed by the horror unfolding around them. Their building had been hit. She could see now, a direct strike that had collapsed part of the front facade and sent residents fleeing into the courtyard, where they had become trapped when subsequent explosions blocked the exits. "Come with me." Anna screamed over the noise, grabbing the nearest child, a girl perhaps 7 with blonde braids and tear-streaked face. "Follow me. Now." She didn't wait to see if they would obey, just started moving back toward her building, pulling the girl with her, trusting that survival instinct would overcome paralysis and the other children would follow. And they did. Thank God they did. Stumbling and running and crawling, a ragged line of terrified children following her across the courtyard toward the dubious safety of the building entrance. An explosion hit close, so close that Anna felt the heat wash over her, felt chunks of brick and mortar rain down around her. Something struck her shoulder hard enough to spin her halfway around, and pain bloomed bright and sharp, but she kept moving, kept pulling the girl forward, kept shouting encouragement to the children behind her. They made it to the entrance hall, all of them, though one boy was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, and another girl seemed unable to hear anything, her eardrums probably damaged by the concussions. Anna counted quickly. 12 children. 12 terrified, traumatized children who were now her responsibility because she had chosen to save them. The basement entrance was blocked. Part of the ceiling had collapsed, sending a cascade of rubble down the stairs that made passage impossible. Anna stared at the blocked passage for a moment, her mind racing, trying to understand what this meant, try to formulate a new plan when the old plan had just become impossible. Another explosion, this one even closer, shaking the entire building so violently that cracks appeared in the walls and more plaster rained down from the ceiling. The building was being hit, she realized with sick certainty. It was taking damage, and if they stayed in the entrance hall, they would be crushed when it came down. "This way," she shouted, herding the children toward the door that led to the basement storage rooms and the side entrance, a route she knew from years of living in the building. The door was locked, had always been locked to prevent theft, but Anna grabbed a piece of fallen masonry and used it to smash the lock, again and again until the mechanism broke and the door swung open. The basement was dark and cold and smelled of damp concrete and mildew, but it was shelter, it was below ground, it was the safest place they could reach. Anna pushed the children through the door and down the narrow stairs, counting them as they passed, making sure all 12 made it through. Then she followed, pulling the damaged door closed behind them as best she could, shutting out the hellish noise from above, though they could still hear the bombs, still feel each explosion to the foundations of the building. The storage basement was a maze of small rooms separated by brick walls, each room assigned to a different apartment for storing coal, preserves, old furniture, and whatever else people couldn't fit in their cramped living spaces. Anna's room was in the back corner, one of the smallest, perhaps 10 feet by 12 feet, with a low ceiling and a single bare bulb that didn't work because the electricity was out. She guided the children there by feel and by memory, navigating the dark passageways, keeping them moving even though every instinct screamed to stop and hide and wait for the nightmare to end. In her storage room, she finally let herself take stock of the situation. The children huddled together in the darkness, some crying quietly, others silent and shaking. Anna could smell blood and knew at least one of them was injured more seriously than she had initially thought. She fumbled in her pocket for the matches she always carried, struck one, and in the brief flare of light, she took in the faces of the children she had saved. 12 pairs of eyes stared back at her, wide with fear and shock and a terrible trust that made her heart ache. They were looking to her to save them, to protect them, to tell them everything would be all right. And Anna had absolutely no idea how she was going to do any of those things. The match burned down to her fingers, and she dropped it, plunging them back into darkness. Above them, the bombing continued. Each explosion a reminder that the world was trying to kill them, that they had survived this long purely by chance, and that chance could run out at any moment. Anna's mind raced, trying to assess their situation, trying to think past the fear and formulate some kind of plan. They were trapped in a basement storage room with no food, no water, no light, no heat. The building above them was being bombed and might collapse at any moment, burying them alive. Even if the building survived, there was no guarantee that anyone would know they were down here, no guarantee of rescue. The normal shelter in the main basement was blocked, and for all she knew, the entire building might be evacuated or destroyed, leaving them entombed in this small room beneath tons of rubble. But they were alive. Against all odds, all 12 children were alive. And she was alive. And as long as they were alive, there was hope. The first priority was immediate survival. She needed to keep the children calm, keep them from panicking, establish some sense of order and safety even in this impossible situation. "Listen to me," Anna said, her voice as steady as she could make it, speaking in Polish, the language of home and comfort. "I know you're frightened. I'm frightened too. But we're safe down here, safer than we were outside. The bombs can't reach us through all this concrete and earth. We just need to wait until the bombing stops, and then we'll find a way out. Do you understand?" Some of the children nodded, though she couldn't see them in the dark. A few murmured agreement. One small voice, barely above a whisper, asked, "Where's my mama?" Anna's heart broke at the question, because she had no answer, no reassurance to give. These children's families might be dead, their building destroyed, their entire world erased in a matter of minutes. But she couldn't tell them that, couldn't add that burden to the trauma they had already experienced. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said honestly, "but I promise you, as soon as it's safe, we'll find out. We'll find your parents and reunite you with your families. But right now, right this moment, my job is to keep you safe, and your job is to help me do that by staying calm and staying together. Can you do that for me?" More nods, more murmured assent. The children wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that an adult was in control and had a plan, even if that adult was a stranger they had just met in the most terrifying circumstances of their young lives. Anna began to take stock of her resources. In her storage room, there were a few pieces of old furniture she had inherited from her parents and hadn't been able to fit in her apartment. A chair with a broken leg, a small table, some boxes of books and papers, a trunk containing winter clothes and blankets that she rotated seasonally. Not much, but more than nothing. She struck another match and located the trunk, opened it, and began pulling out blankets. There were 4 of them, wool blankets that smelled of mothballs in storage, but were blessedly warm. She distributed them among the children, wrapping the smallest ones completely, making sure everyone had at least some covering. By the light of a third match, she examined the injured children more carefully. The boy with the cut on his forehead was bleeding steadily, but not dangerously. Head wounds always bled more than they should, she knew from her basic first aid training. She tore a strip from her slip and used it to bandage his head, applying pressure to stop the bleeding. The girl who couldn't hear seemed otherwise unharmed, though Anna worried about permanent damage. A few of the other children had minor cuts and bruises. scrapes from falling or being hit by flying debris, but nothing that required immediate medical attention. They were extraordinarily lucky, she realized. 12 children had made it through a bombing raid with only minor injuries. It was a miracle, though Anna wasn't sure she believed in miracles anymore. Not after 4 years of occupation had shown her exactly how much God seemed to care about the suffering of innocents. The bombing continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 or 40 minutes. Each explosion made the children flinch, made the walls shake, sent dust drifting down from the ceiling. Anna talked to them through it, keeping up a steady stream of conversation, asking their names, their ages, distracting them with questions about school and hobbies and favorite foods, anything to keep their minds occupied and prevent panic from setting in. She learned their names and began to construct a mental picture of each child. Zofia, the 7-year-old girl with blonde braids who she had grabbed first in courtyard. Jakub, the boy with the head injury, 9 years old and trying very hard to be brave despite obvious pain. Maria, the girl who couldn't hear, 8 years old with dark eyes that held a depth of trauma that made Anna want to weep. Stefan, Pyotr, Helena, Katarzyna, Tomasz, Ava, Jersey. Anna herself laughed bitterly at that one. Another Anna, Christoph, and finally little Malgorzata, who was only 5 and kept asking for her mother in a voice that grew quieter and more resigned with each asking. They were working-class children from the neighboring building. She gathered from their accents and the little details they volunteered. Children of factory workers and shopkeepers, of laborers and clerks, ordinary families trying to survive extraordinary circumstances. Some of them had lost parents already to the war, living with aunts or uncles or grandparents. Others still had intact families, or at least they had this morning, before the bombs fell. When the explosions finally stopped, the silence that followed was almost worse than the noise had been. It was a silence of destruction, of a neighborhood transformed into rubble, of lives ended and futures erased. Anna waited a long time before she tried the door to the storage room, listening carefully for any sound that might indicate continued danger. She heard nothing except the occasional settling sound of damaged structures, the creak and groan of buildings that had been pushed to the limit of their structural integrity. She made her way carefully through the dark basement to the stairs, using her hands to navigate, moving slowly to avoid tripping over debris. When she reached the stairs and tried to open the door she had smashed earlier, she found it blocked from the outside. Someone had fallen against it, or perhaps the entire entrance hall had collapsed. Either way, they were trapped. Anna forced herself to remain calm, to think logically despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. There had to be another way out. The basement must have multiple exits, for ventilation, if nothing else. She just needed to find them. She made her way back to the children, careful not to let them hear the desperation in her voice. "The door is blocked," she said matter-of-factly. "But don't worry. There are other ways out. I'm going to explore the basement and find one. I want you all to stay here together. Stay quiet and wait for me to come back. Jakub, you're the oldest. You're in charge while I'm gone. Keep everyone together and keep everyone calm. Can you do that?" "Yes, miss," Jakub said, his voice uncertain but determined. Anna lit one of her precious remaining matches and used it to light a stub of candle she found in a box of her belongings. The candle would give her maybe 30 minutes of light, enough to explore the basement and hopefully find an exit. She left the children huddled under their blankets and began a systematic search of the storage rooms. The basement was larger than she had realized, extending under the entire footprint of the building, with additional rooms and passageways she had never explored because they weren't relevant to her storage needs. She found rooms filled with coal for the building's heating system, though the furnace had been shut down years ago for lack of fuel. She found a room that might have once been a workshop, with tools and workbenches covered in dust. She found a room that was clearly being used for something illicit, with crates of black market goods stacked against the walls, though most of the crates had been broken open and their contents looted, probably by previous occupants of the basement seeking to survive. And finally, in the far corner of the basement, beneath what Anna calculated must be the rear of the building, she found a small window high up on the wall, a ventilation window that had been blocked from the outside by a metal grate, but was otherwise open to the outside world. Through the grate, She could see a sliver of daylight, gray and dim but unmistakably real. Anna examined the window carefully by candlelight. The opening was perhaps 2 feet wide and a foot tall, barely large enough for a child to squeeze through, definitely too small for an adult. The grate was secured from the outside with bolts that she had no way to reach or remove. Even if she could get the grate off, even if she could boost one of the children up to the window, where would they go? The building might be surrounded by rubble, by fire, by German soldiers investigating the damage. Sending a child out alone could be sending them to their death, but it was a potential escape route, and that was more than she had 5 minutes ago. Anna filed the information away and continued her exploration, making a mental map of the basement, noting which areas seemed structurally sound and which showed signs of damage from a bombing. By the time she made it back to her storage room, the candle was guttering and the children were starting to panic at her absence. She reassured them quickly, then gathered them around and explained the situation as honestly as she dared. "We're trapped down here for now," she said. "The main exits are blocked, and I haven't found another way out yet. But that doesn't mean we won't find one. It just means we need to be patient and wait for the right opportunity. In the meantime, we have shelter, we have blankets, and we have each other. We're going to be okay." "But I'm hungry," little Malgorzata said, and immediately other children chimed in with their own complaints. Hunger, thirst, cold, fear, the need to use the toilet. The practical realities of survival that didn't pause just because the world was ending outside. Anna had no food except a small piece of bread she hadn't eaten that morning, which she broke into 12 tiny pieces and distributed among the children, knowing it wouldn't satisfy anyone, but hoping it would at least give them something. Water was a more immediate problem. They would need water soon, within hours, or dehydration would become a serious concern, especially for the youngest children. She explored her storage room more thoroughly and found, tucked away in a corner, a jar of preserves her mother had made years ago, before the war. Plums and syrup, sealed with wax, probably still good though the jar had been sitting in this cold basement for years. She also found a bottle of what turned out to be vodka, likely left by a previous tenant, or perhaps hidden by someone in her family during Prohibition years long ago. Not ideal for children, but if diluted with water, it could be used for sterilization or, in extreme circumstances, for warming someone with hypothermia. The toilet situation was solved with a bucket she found in another storage room, placed in a corner behind a makeshift curtain of old sheets for privacy. Not dignified, but functional, and dignity was a luxury they couldn't afford right now. Anna divided the preserves among the children, giving them each a spoonful of sweetness that brought tears to some of their eyes because it had been so long since they had tasted anything so good. She saved half the jar for later, knowing that rationing would be critical if they were going to survive for any length of time. The first night in the basement was the hardest. The temperature dropped as darkness fell outside, and despite the blankets, the children were cold, huddled together for warmth in the small storage room. They couldn't light a fire because there was no ventilation, and the smoke would kill them faster than the cold. Anna piled all the blankets over the children and added her own coat to the mix, then laid down with them, using her body heat to warm as many as she could reach. The darkness was absolute, thick and oppressive in a way that city dwellers rarely experienced. No street lights, no moonlight penetrating the small basement window, no electric lights, nothing. Just blackness, so complete that Anna couldn't see her hand in front of her face. The children whispered each other in the dark, seeking comfort in the sound of human voices, and Anna told them stories, fairy tales she remembered from her own childhood, stories of brave princes and clever princesses, of magical creatures and happy endings, stories that had no resemblance to the reality they were living but provided escape and hope in equal measure. Some of the children cried that first night, quiet sobs muffled against blankets or Anna's shoulder. She held them and rocked them and whispered reassurances she wasn't sure were true. Others slept fitfully, making small distressed sounds in their sleep, acting out their trauma in whatever dreams visited them in this underground darkness. Anna herself didn't sleep at all, keeping watch even though there was nothing to watch for, listening to the sounds of the buildings settling above them, to the occasional distant explosion from other parts of the city, to the breathing of 12 children whose lives now depended entirely on her ability to keep them alive until rescue came. If rescue came, the thought was like ice water in her veins. What if no one knew they were down here? What if everyone assumed the building had been evacuated or destroyed? What if no one was coming to save them because no one knew they needed saving? Anna pushed the thought away, forced herself to think practically rather than catastrophically. Morning would come, in daylight. She would be able to assess their situation better, to formulate a real plan rather than just reacting to immediate crises. They had survived the first night. That was accomplishment enough. Dawn brought no light to the basement, but Anna's internal clock told her when morning had arrived. She had spent enough years waking before dawn that her body knew the rhythms of day and night even without external cues. She roused herself carefully, extracting herself from the tangle of sleeping children without waking them, and began to explore the basement again by feel and by memory. In daylight, or what passed for daylight in the ruined world above, she might be able to see through that small window, to assess what conditions were like outside, to potentially signal for help if anyone was out there to see. She made her way through the dark corridors to the back room where the window was located, moving carefully to avoid making noise that might wake the children. When she reached the window, she found a crate and dragged it underneath, climbed up on it, and pressed her face to the grate. Outside, she could see a narrow view of the courtyard behind her building, or what was left of it. The neighboring building, the one where the children had come from, was simply gone, reduced to a pile of rubble 3 stories high, smoke still rising from spots where fires continued to burn. The devastation was total, complete, a perfect erasure of a building that had stood for 20 years. Anna felt sick looking at it, thinking about how many people had been in that building when the bombs fell, how many had died in seconds or been buried alive beneath thousands of tons of brick and concrete. And she thought about how close she and the children had come to the same fate, how her impulsive decision to run into danger instead of away from it had been the only thing that stood between 12 children and certain death. She couldn't see much beyond the immediate courtyard, but what she could see told her that the neighborhood had been heavily damaged. Other buildings showed signs of bomb damage, with collapsed walls and shattered windows. She saw no people moving about, heard no sounds of rescue operations or recovery efforts. Either it was too dangerous to venture out yet, or there were simply too many sites of destruction for responders to cover them all quickly. Anna climbed down from the crate and made her way back to her storage room, where she found several of the children awake and whispering to each other in the darkness. She announced her presence, so she wouldn't startle them, then settled down with them to discuss their situation. "We're going to be here for a little while," she said, keeping her voice calm and matter-of-fact. "The building we're under was damaged in the bombing, and the neighborhood outside is very dangerous right now. But we're safe down here, and eventually someone will find us. In the meantime, we need to stay calm, stay warm, and ration our supplies carefully. Does everyone understand?" The children nodded or murmured agreement, though Anna could hear the fear in their voices, the questions they wanted to ask but were afraid to voice. Questions about their families, about when they could go home, about whether home even existed anymore. She organized them into tasks to keep their minds occupied. The older children helped sort through the storage room, looking for anything useful. They found more blankets, a box of old clothes that could be used for bandages or warmth, a lamp that unfortunately had no oil, and some old newspapers that could be used for insulation or, in extreme circumstances, as fuel for fire, though Anna hoped it wouldn't come to that. The younger children were assigned the task of folding and organizing the blankets, a simple job that gave them something to do with their hands and their minds. Little Malgorzata attached herself to Anna like a shadow, following her everywhere, holding onto her skirt, clearly viewing Anna as a substitute mother in the absence of her own. The water situation became critical by late morning. The children were thirsty, and Anna knew that dehydration would set in quickly, especially in the cold, dry air of the basement. She made another exploration of the basement, this time specifically looking for water sources, and found her answer in a small puddle that had formed in one corner, where water was seeping to the foundation wall from the rain-soaked earth outside. It wasn't much, barely enough to collect in a tin can she found the workshop room, and it certainly wasn't clean by any normal standard. But it was water, and water meant life. Anna used one of the old sheets to fashion a crude filter, letting the water drip through multiple layers of fabric to remove at least the visible sediment. Then she boiled it over a small fire she built in a metal bucket, using some of the black market crate wood as fuel, knowing the risk of smoke, but judging dehydration the more immediate threat. The smoke did accumulate in the basement, making everyone cough and their eyes water, but the small window provided just enough ventilation to prevent them from suffocating. Anna let the water cool, then distributed it among the children in careful measured amounts, making them drink slowly so they wouldn't make themselves sick. Food was a harder problem. She had the remaining half jar of plum preserves, but that would last maybe another day if she stretched it. After that, they had nothing unless she could find something else in the basement or they were rescued. Anna spent the afternoon conducting a thorough search of every storage room in the basement, looking for anything edible. Most rooms contained only furniture, old clothes, boxes of papers, and documents, the detritus of lives interrupted by war. But in one room, she struck gold in the form of a sack of potatoes, perhaps 20 pounds, stored by some resident who had probably been evacuated or killed before they could retrieve them. The potatoes were starting to sprout, but they were still fundamentally sound, still edible with proper preparation. She also found a bag of dried beans, a few onions that were soft but not rotted, and most precious of all, a small tin of salt. With these supplies, she could make soup, could stretch their resources for days instead of hours. It wasn't much, but was enough to buy them time, to keep 12 children alive while they waited for rescue that might or might not come. That evening, Anna prepared their first proper meal in the basement. She used her small fire to boil water, added potatoes cut into small pieces with a pocket knife she had in her purse, threw in some beans that she soaked in cold water, and seasoned all with a tiny pinch of the precious salt. The result was a thin, bland soup that in peacetime would have been considered barely edible. But to 12 hungry children who hadn't eaten in over 24 hours, it was a feast. They sat in a circle in the darkness, passing around a single pot, each taking a small amount before passing it on, a communal meal that bonded them together as surely as any family dinner. Anna made sure everyone ate, even forcing Lil Malgorzata to take a few more spoonfuls when the girl, L, create a prompt to represent the image of the climax of this script to create the thumb. Make it impactful with lots of emotional, facial, and body expressions. Be very detailed in the setting. The image should be ultra-realistic in the Netflix style. Insist that she was full, recognizing the signs of a child usually going hungry trying to save food for others. After the meal, Anna organized the children into sleeping arrangements, pairing the older children with younger ones, so that everyone had a buddy to keep them warm and provide comfort. She told them more stories, her voice hoarse from talking, but determined to give them something positive to focus on before sleep. She told them about her own childhood, about summer vacations spent in the countryside at her grandparents' farm, about swimming in a river and picking berries and sleeping under the stars. She told them about the peacetime world they barely remembered, a world she prayed they would live to see again. The days blended together after that, one indistinguishable from another in the unchanging darkness of the basement. Anna established routines because routines gave structure and structure gave hope. They woke at what she estimated was morning and said prayers, Catholic prayers that most of the children knew by heart, even if Anna herself had long since stopped believing that any God was listening. They ate a small breakfast of soup or, on lucky days, a bit of potato roasted over the fire. They did lessons because Anna was still a teacher, and these were still children who needed education. And if she was going to keep them in this basement, the least she could do was try to keep their minds sharp. She taught them by memory and by improvisation. Mathematics problems worked out in the dark or scratched on the walls with bits of charcoal. Polish literature recited from memory, poems and passages she had once required her students to memorize, and that now provided entertainment and cultural connection. History lessons about Poland's past, about the kings and queens and battles and moments of glory that had shaped their nation, lessons that were strictly forbidden by the occupiers, but that Anna taught anyway, because these children needed to know who they were and where they came from. The children responded with a resilience that humbled her. They adapted to their circumstances with the remarkable flexibility of the young, turning the basement into a kind of home, creating games out of nothing, finding joy in small things like an extra spoonful of soup or a story particularly well told. They took care of each other, the older children watching over the younger, sharing blankets without being asked, comforting each other when nightmares or fear or grief threatened to overwhelm. Zofia emerged as a natural leader among the girls, organizing games and mediating disputes with maturity beyond her 7 years. Jakob, despite his head injury, which was healing well thanks to Anna's care, became her lieutenant among the boys, helping maintain order and encouraging the younger children when spirits flagged. Maria, the girl who still couldn't hear properly, proved to have talent for drawing, creating pictures on the wall with charcoal that told stories of their life in the basement, crude but expressive sketches that captured something essential about their experience. But the situation was deteriorating in ways Anna couldn't fully hide from them. The food was running out despite her careful rationing. The water source in the wall was slowing to a trickle as the weather outside apparently dried out. The cold was getting worse as autumn deepened toward winter, and she had no more blankets to distribute, no way to generate more heat without fuel for fires, and the black market was long since exhausted. Worse, some of the children were getting sick. Stefan, an 8-year-old boy who had been one of the healthier children initially, developed a cough that grew progressively worse, a wet, rattling sound that Anna recognized with dread as potentially being pneumonia. Without antibiotics, without proper medical care, pneumonia could kill a child in days. All Anna could do was keep him warm, keep him hydrated with the limited water they had, and pray that his young immune system would be strong enough to fight off the infection. Little Malgorzata was losing weight at an alarming rate, her small face growing pinched and hollow, her eyes too large in her thin face. She barely ate anymore, claiming she wasn't hungry even when Anna knew she was starving. The child was giving up, Anna realized with horror, surrendering to circumstances that even her 5-year-old mind recognized as hopeless. Anna herself was struggling. The constant cold, the limited food, the psychological stress of being solely responsible for 12 young lives, the gnawing fear that they had been forgotten, that no one was looking for them, that they would simply die down here in the dark, and their bodies wouldn't be found until the war was over and someone finally excavated the rubble. She forced herself to remain strong for the children, to project confidence and hope she didn't feel, but in the quiet moments when they were sleeping and she was alone with her thoughts, despair threatened to overwhelm her. It was on what Anna calculated as the 10th day in the basement that she heard the voices. She was near the window, checking the water trickle and hoping against hope that recent rain might have replenished it, when she heard the sound, voices speaking Polish, calling out the unmistakable sound of a rescue operation in progress. Her heart leaped with hope, so fierce it was almost painful. She scrambled up onto the crate and pressed her face to the grate, trying to see out, trying to locate the source of the voices. There were men in the courtyard. She could see them now, wearing civilian clothes and carrying tools, picking through the rubble of the destroyed building. "Here!" Anna screamed, her voice cracking from disuse and desperation. "We're here, in the basement. Help us." But her voice was too weak, couldn't carry through the thick concrete and earth, couldn't penetrate the noise of the rescue operation above. The men continued their work, oblivious of the 12 children and one desperate teacher trapped beneath their feet. Anna screamed until her throat was raw, pounded on the metal grate until her hands were bruised, but no one heard. No one came. Eventually, the voices faded as the rescue team moved to a different location, and Anna was left sobbing with frustration and crushing disappointment. She made her way back to the storage room where the children waited, and she couldn't hide her tears, couldn't pretend everything was fine. The older children understood what had happened, without needing explanation. Rescue had been within reach and had slipped away. They might not get another chance. That night was the lowest point. Stefan's cough was worse, his breathing labored and wheezing. Malgorzata was unresponsive, lying listlessly under her blankets, barely drinking even when Anna begged her to take just one sip of water. The other children were quiet, subdued, the weight of the situation finally overwhelming their resilience. Anna sat in the darkness and faced the reality she had been avoiding. They were dying. Slowly but certainly, cold and hunger and sickness were killing them, and she was powerless to stop it. In trying to save 12 children, She had only prolonged their dying, trapped them in this cold, dark tomb where they would perish out of sight, forgotten by a world too busy destroying itself to notice 12 more casualties. The thought of giving up crossed her mind for the first time, of simply lying down with the children, wrapping them all in blankets, and letting sleep take them into death. It would be peaceful, relatively painless, certainly better than watching them slowly waste away from starvation and disease. But even as the thought formed, Anna rejected it. She was a teacher. Her job was to protect children, to give them tools to survive, to refuse to accept defeat as long as breath remained in her body. And she was Polish, from a nation that had been invaded and occupied and partitioned and erased from maps multiple times throughout history, yet had always survived, always returned, always refused to surrender, even when surrender seemed the only logical option. She had gotten them this far. She would get them the rest of the way. She just needed to find a way. Anna spent what remained of that night thinking, planning, discarding ideas and formulating new ones. By dawn, she had a plan. It was desperate and dangerous and had a very low chance of success, but it was something, and something was infinitely better than nothing. She gathered the children and explained it to them in simple terms. The adults above ground didn't know they were down here. The window was too small for Anna to fit through, and the grate was bolted from the outside. But the window was large enough for one of the smaller children. If she could boost a child up to the window, if that child could somehow get the grate off on the outside, or squeeze to the gaps in grate, they could go for help, could tell the rescue workers that people were trapped in the basement. It was asking a child to do something terrifying, to leave the dubious safety of the basement, to venture out into a ruined city filled with danger, to find help and bring it back. It was asking more than any adult should ask of a child, but it was their only chance. "I'll go," Zofia said immediately, her 7-year-old voice steady and determined. "No, I should go," Jakob argued. "I'm older, I'm stronger." "You're too big," Zofia counted logically. "You won't fit through the window. It has to be one of the small ones. It has to be me or Malgorzata, and Malgorzata is too weak. So it has to be me." Anna wanted to argue, wanted to find another way, wanted to volunteer herself, except she knew she physically couldn't fit through that narrow opening. But Zofia was right. Of all the children, she was the best choice. Smart, brave, small enough to fit, and strong enough to have a chance of success. "Are you sure?" Anna asked, kneeling down to look Zofia in the eyes. "If you do this, you'll be alone out there. It will be dangerous. I can't promise you'll be safe. We're not safe here either," Zofia said with devastating logic. "At least this way. Maybe we all survive instead of all dying." So Anna agreed, though it felt like sending a child to her death. They waited until what Anna judged was mid-morning, when rescue workers were most likely to be out and about. Then Anna took Zofia to the back room with the window, with several of the older children following to help and to say goodbye. The preparation was simple, because there was so little they could do. Anna explained which direction Zofia should go once she got outside, how to find a main street, where to look for rescue workers or Polish police or anyone in authority who could help. She made Zofia repeat the instructions back to her 3 times to make sure the girl had them memorized. She gave her the last piece of bread wrapped in paper, water in a small bottle, and her own sweater to keep the girl warm. Then came the hardest part, getting Zofia through the window. Anna and Jakob worked together on the grate, pushing and pulling and prying at the metal bars, trying to create a gap large enough for a small child to squeeze through. The bolts were rusted and old, and with enough force, they managed to bend one section of grate outward, creating an opening perhaps 14 inches wide and 8 inches tall. It wasn't much, but it might be enough. Anna boosted Zofia up to the window, and the little girl began the painful process of squeezing to the narrow opening. She had to go head first, wriggling and twisting, with Anna and Jakob pushing from below while trying to be gentle, trying not to hurt her. Zofia's coat caught on the grate and tore. Her cheek scraped against concrete, leaving a streak of blood. But she kept moving, kept pushing forward with grim determination, and finally, agonizingly, she was through, tumbling out into the courtyard on the other side. Anna pressed her face to the opening, trying to see the girl. "Zofia, are you hurt?" "I'm okay," came the small voice from outside. shaky but determined. "I'm going to get help, Miss Anna. I'll bring them back. I promise." "Be careful," Anna called after her. "Be safe. We'll be waiting for you." And then Zofia was gone, running across the rubble-strewn courtyard, a small figure in a torn coat disappearing into the devastated landscape of occupied Warsaw. Anna watched until she couldn't see the girl anymore, then slowly climbed down from the crate, her heart in her throat. Her prayers for Zofia's safety, the most fervent prayers she had offered since the war began. The waiting that followed was the worst yet. Every sound made Anna's heart race, hoping it was rescue, fearing it was disaster. The other children sensed the tension and grew quiet, huddling together, waiting for news that would either save them or confirm their doom. Hours passed. Morning turned afternoon. Afternoon began to fade toward evening. Stefan's breathing grew more labored. Malgorzata slipped into a sleep, so Deep Anna had to check repeatedly to make sure the child was still alive. Anna began to face the possibility that Zofia hadn't made it, that something had happened to her out there in the ruins, that their last hope had been extinguished along with the life of one impossibly brave 7-year-old girl. And then, as darkness was beginning to fall outside, Anna heard the voices again. Not distant this time, but close, right above them, accompanied by the sound of tools against stone, of rubble being moved, of a rescue operation focused directly on their building. "We're here!" Anna screamed, pounding on the ceiling, making as much noise as she possibly could. In the basement storage rooms, 12 children and 1 adult. "We're here." This time, someone heard. The sounds of digging intensified, focused now, purposeful. Anna roused the children, got them on their feet, gathered their few possessions. "They're coming," she told them, her voice breaking with relief and joy and exhaustion. "Someone heard us. They're coming to get us out." It took another 2 hours of careful excavation before the rescuers finally broke through, clearing enough rubble to reach the block basement entrance and forcing it open. Light flooded down the stairs, electric torchlight that seemed brilliant as sunshine after so many days in darkness. Voices called down in Polish, asking if anyone was there. How many people were they hurt? Anna called back, her voice hoarse but strong, giving them the information they needed. 12 children, ranging in age from 5 to 12. 1 adult, some injuries, some illness, all of them weak from hunger and cold but alive. Miraculously, impossibly, all of them still alive. The rescuers came down the stairs, men in civilian clothes, carrying medical supplies and blankets, and thermoses of hot soup. They were members of the Polish resistance. Anna learned later, part of the underground network that continued to operate despite the occupation, saving lives and documenting atrocities, and keeping hope alive through the darkest days of the war. They carried Stefan out first because his breathing was the most concerning, wrapping him in blankets and taking him directly to a secret field hospital where underground doctors would treat him. Then Malgorzata, small and light as a bird, barely conscious but still breathing. Then one by one, the other children, each wrapped in blankets and carried gently up the stairs into the cold November evening. Anna went last, her legs barely able to support her weight after days of inactivity and inadequate nutrition. But she walked out under her own power, climbing those basement stairs into the fresh air, breathing deeply the cold wind that tasted of smoke and destruction, but also of freedom, of survival, of hope. In the courtyard, she found Zofia waiting, wrapped in a blanket too large for her small frame, her face streaked with dirt and tears, but lit up with a smile that made Anna's heart ache with love and pride and gratitude. The girl had made it, had found help, had brought them salvation. Anna dropped to her knees and pulled Zofia into a fierce embrace, holding the child as they both wept, releasing the fear and stress and trauma of the past 12 days. "You saved us," Anna whispered into Zofia's hair. "You brave, incredible girl. You saved all of us." "You saved us first," Zofia replied, her small arms tight around Anna's neck. "When you ran into the courtyard during the bombing, when you took us to the basement, when you kept us alive, all those days. You saved us, Miss Anna. I just went for help." The children were taken to a secret location, a house in a neighborhood that had escaped major bombing, where they could be fed and warmed and cared for by members of the resistance network. Anna stayed with them, refusing to be separated, still feeling responsible for their well-being even though the immediate danger had passed. She watched them eat real food, soup and bread, and even some meat, watched color return to their faces, watched them begin to smile and play and act like children again instead of small traumatized survivors just barely clinging to life. Over the following days and weeks, the resistance worked to reunite the children with whatever family they had left. Some had lost everything. Their parents killed in the bombing or taken away by the Germans earlier in the occupation. These children were placed with families in the resistance network, given false papers and new identities. Hidden in plain sight in a city where death came daily and everyone was struggling just to survive. But some of the children did have family who had survived, relatives who had been searching frantically, who had given up hope and then had it restored when word came that their children had been found alive in a basement, kept safe by a teacher who had refused to let them die. The reunions were tearful and joyous, parents and children embracing, as if they would never let go, as if physical contact was the only thing that could convince them that this was real, that they had both survived, that they had been given back what they thought was lost forever. Zofia's mother had survived the bombing, had been in a different part of the building when it was hit, and had escaped with injuries but her life intact. When mother and daughter were reunited, Anna watched from a distance, not wanting to intrude on their private moment. But Zofia's mother sought her out afterward, this hollow-eyed woman who looked like she had aged years in the past 2 weeks, and she took Anna's hands and said simply, "Thank you. There are no words adequate to thank you, but thank you for giving me back my daughter." Stefan recovered from his pneumonia, slowly but steadily, his young body fighting off the infection with the help of antibiotics the resistance doctors managed to acquire. Malgorzata regained her strength and her spirit, transforming back into the bright, cheerful 5-year-old she had been before trauma and hunger had nearly extinguished her light. Anna stayed with the resistance after that, working as a teacher in her underground school system, caring for orphan children, doing whatever she could help in the ongoing struggle against occupation. She never returned to her apartment in the bomb building. It had been damaged beyond repair, and besides, too many memories lingered there, too many ghosts of the days in the basement that haunted her dreams. The war continued for another year and a half after that November day. Anna lived through the Warsaw Uprising in 1944, when the Polish resistance tried to liberate the city before the Soviet army arrived. 63 days of brutal urban combat that left the city even more destroyed and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. She survived the systematic destruction of Warsaw that followed, when the Germans razed the city block by block in retaliation for the uprising, demolishing over 80% of the buildings and turning one of Europe's great capitals into a wasteland of rubble. And finally, she lived to see liberation in January of 1945, when Soviet forces entered what was left of Warsaw and the German occupation ended at last. She was 34 years old, looked 50, and had seen enough horror and death to fill multiple lifetimes. But she was alive. And more importantly, 12 children were alive because of choices she had made on one cold October morning when bombs were falling and every instinct screamed to her to save herself instead of running toward danger. After the war, Anna continued teaching, working to rebuild Poland's education system from the ruins, training a new generation of teachers, and ensuring that children who had grown up amid horror still received the education they needed to become the adults who would build a better future. She never married, never had children of her own, but she considered every student she taught to be in some way her child, her responsibility, her contribution to ensuring that all the death and destruction hadn't been entirely in vain. The 12 children she had saved in the basement stayed in touch with her for the rest of her life. They visited regularly, bringing their own children to meet Aunt Anna, the teacher who had saved their parents. They told and retold the story of those days in the basement, ensuring that the tale was passed down through generations, that their children and grandchildren would know what one ordinary woman had done when extraordinary circumstances demanded it. Zofia became a teacher herself, inspired by Anna's example, and spent 40 years teaching primary school children in rebuilt Warsaw. She named her first daughter Anna, and her granddaughter Anna as well, ensuring that the name would echo through her family's history. On the wall of her classroom, she hung a photograph from 1943, a grainy image that showed 12 children standing with a thin woman in a worn coat, all of them squinting in the sunlight, all of them alive against impossible odds. Under the photograph was a simple caption: "Sometimes courage means just refusing to give up." Anna Kowalski lived to be 81 years old, dying peacefully in her sleep in 1992, in a world that bore little resemblance to the one she had known during the war. She died in a free Poland, in a city that had been painstakingly rebuilt from ruins, in an apartment that had electricity and heat and running water, surrounded by a photograph of the hundreds of students she had taught over 50 years of dedicated service. At her funeral, the church was packed with people whose lives she had touched. Former students, now elderly themselves, shared memories of a teacher who had believed in them, who had pushed them to be better, who had shown them that education was a pathway to freedom and dignity. The 12 children, now in their 50s and 60s, stood together at the front of the church, a living testament to the fact that one person's courage could change the trajectory of multiple lives. And Zofia, now a grandmother herself, delivered the eulogy, her voice steady and strong as she told the story one more time. The story of a bombing raid and 12 terrified children, and one teacher who ran toward danger instead of away from it. The story of 12 days in a cold, dark basement where death waited patiently but was denied its prize. The story of a 7-year-old girl who squeezed through a narrow window to save her friends. The story of survival and courage and the stubborn human refusal to surrender even when surrender seems inevitable. Anna Kowalski taught us many things, Zofia said, looking out at the crowded church. She taught us mathematics and literature and history. But the most important lesson she taught us came during those days in the basement. She taught us that when the world is ending around you, when everything seems hopeless and death seems certain, you don't give up. You keep going. You take care of each other. You make soup from potatoes and tell stories in the dark, and you absolutely refuse to accept that this is how your story ends. She taught us that one person can make a difference, that 12 lives matter just as much as 12,000 lives, and that the measure of a person is not what they do when it's easy, but what they do when it's impossible. She saved us, and in saving us, she showed us how to save ourselves, how to find strength we didn't know we had, how to survive and help others survive. That's her legacy. Not just the lives she saved, but the lesson she taught us about what it means to be human in inhumane circumstances. The story of Anna Kowalski and the 12 children spread beyond the borders of Poland in the decades after the war, becoming one of thousands of stories of individual courage during the darkest period of human history. Historians documented it, journalists wrote about it, and eventually, filmmakers adapted it, telling and retelling the tale of the schoolteacher who had 12 kids in a bombed basement and kept them alive through courage and determination and the absolute refusal to accept defeat. But the real legacy wasn't in the stories or the accolades or the recognition that came years later. The real legacy was in the lives that were saved and what those lives became. 12 children grew into adults who contributed to rebuilding a shattered nation. They became teachers and doctors and engineers and artists, raising families and building careers and living full lives that had nearly been cut short at ages 5 and 7 and 9 and 12. They had children who had children who had children, and each generation carried forward some echo of those days in the basement, some understanding that life is precious and fragile and worth fighting for even when the fight seems hopeless. And they carried forward the lesson that Anna had taught them without words, simply through her actions on one October morning, when she chose to run into danger to save children she didn't know, when she chose to keep them alive when keeping them alive seemed impossible, when she chose to never give up even when giving up would have been so much easier. That lesson echoed through time and across borders, inspiring others who face their own impossible situations, their own moments when they had to choose between safety and courage, between saving themselves and saving others. The lesson that one person can make a difference, that 12 lives matter, that the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to quit, refuse to surrender, refuse to accept that death and destruction have the final word. Anna Kowalski was one woman. She had no special training in crisis survival, no superhuman abilities, no resources beyond her own determination and her fierce love for children she barely knew. She was terrified the entire time, convinced she was going to fail, certain that her efforts were inadequate and would result in tragedy. But she tried anyway. She kept trying when trying seemed pointless, kept fighting when fighting seemed futile, kept hoping when hope seemed stupid. And because she tried, 12 children lived. Because she refused to give up, 12 lives were saved. Because she ran toward danger that October morning instead of away from it, 12 futures became possible that would otherwise have been erased in an instant of fire and falling bombs. That's the real story. Not just what Anna did, but what her actions made possible. The teachers those children became and the students they taught. The families they raised and the communities they served. The ripples spreading outward from one moment of impossible courage, touching thousands of lives across decades, proving again and again that individual actions matter. That one person choosing to do the right thing, even when it's a hard thing, can change the world in ways large and small. We all face our basement moments, times when we have to decide who we are and what we stand for, times when the easy choice is to look away, to save ourselves, to let someone else take responsibility. And in those moments, we get to choose. We get to decide if we'll be the person who runs into the courtyard when bombs are falling, who takes 12 terrified children into a dark basement and keeps them alive through sheer force of will, who refuses to accept that some lives don't matter enough to risk our own. Anna Kowalski chose. She ran into danger. She saved 12 children. And in doing so, she proved something that every generation needs to learn again, that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary courage when circumstances demand it, that the most heroic acts are often the most terrifying, and that the difference between tragedy and triumph is sometimes just one person who refuses to walk away, who refuses to give up, who refuses to accept that this is how the story has to end. That's her legacy. That's the lesson. That's the story of the schoolteacher who hid 12 kids in a bomb basement and gave them back their futures, one cold day at a time, one bowl of thin soup at a time, one story told in the darkness at a time, until finally, miraculously, impossibly, help came and they all walked out into the light, scarred but alive, traumatized but surviving, changed forever but still here, still fighting, still refusing to let the darkness win.